Is the absence of violence the same as peace? Ultimately, if we look at our most violent communities and we stop the violence for a second, would they look like communities that don't have violence? Would they look like what has been termed our coolest communities? Or would they be communities still without resources, still places where people don't particularly want to go? While we know that violence prevention is essential, it's necessary, it's not sufficient, it's not enough. We need to do more than just prevent violence. We need to enable the infrastructure to build resilient communities to keep that violence at bay. But for many people, the question is, why is stopping violence so necessary? Why can't we now just flood the zone with economic resources? What is it about violence that is so corrosive and blinding? Because we know that if you are a victim of violence, or if you're a perpetrator of violence, that it leaves a scar on you like a corrosive acid. But in addition, it also blinds you. And what do I mean by that? Professor Sharkey is a professor at New York University, and he wrote this phenomenal book, The Uneasy Peace. Here he tried to examine what is it about the last sort of 20 years that led to a historic decline in violence in America. He was trying to understand why some communities stopped being violent and why some remained violent. He was very interested in the concept of education in this concept as well. So he went to the lab where his friends were working, and he looked at an experiment where mice do a maze to find cheese. Okay? You've all seen it or sort of understood this. The mice learns the maze well enough and then gets the cheese as quickly as possible. But the researchers found something extremely interesting. If, instead of just a maze, the mice had cats outside of the maze, and cats are the natural predators of mice, and they could see the cats outside the cage, the mice couldn't do the maze anymore. They freaked out. They ran around in circles. Because the part of our brain that enables us to do deep learning, to remember what we have learned before, cannot function if there is a predator outside. Violence is blinding because when Pat Sharkey took this understanding and looked at test scores of public school kids who had witnessed violence a week before the test, they'd even seen it. They weren't perpetrators, they weren't victims, but they saw it. They lost 2 years of educational attainment. You can go to the best schools. If you've witnessed violence before you take that test, you are not doing well on that test. Because violence is blinding. So if we think about violence as water that we're trying to hold back, we have to ask ourselves, how long can we hold it back? If our violence prevention programs are phenomenal, they're great, they're exceptional, they manage to put people into job placements, they manage to stop and ceasefire the violence. Ultimately, if we're holding back the water and nothing is in the space, the water will come crashing down upon our heads. So we have to ask ourselves, what fills the space? What can we put where violence once was, in the absence of violence, to ensure it doesn't come back? In international conflicts, the answer is often walls. You put walls in between violence, between communities who hate each other. You put police in that space. You try and stop the violence. You try and stop the corrosive elements in order to give you an opportunity to deal with the things that underlie the violence. It kind of makes sense. You can't build while there's violence, so stop it for a second, and then, have the opportunity to deal with it. But if we don't put anything but walls in that space, if we assume that we can just police our way out of this problem, if we flood the space with people trying to hold it back, we intensify the violence where it is, and it metastasizes like a cancer. It spreads throughout. And we've seen that in our own city. So if the answer isn't walls, what is it that holds the space? What is it that we can put there? And the first thing we have to recognize is that that space is something. The absence of violence might not be peace, but it is possibility. A community that has done the hard work, that has fought back violence, has created a peace dividend. And in the international context, a peace dividend is what you use to inspire people, to incentivize them to continue stopping violence. We need to find a way that in this investable moment, in this potentiality that is created through the absence of violence, that we can return that equity that opportunity back to the communities who created that space. What fills the space? Well, firstly, we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we capture the value? The absence of violence is valuable, fundamentally. And there are two different ways in this current context within this city that we can assess this value. The first is city services. If we look at all of the policing, all of the Cook County Jail, if we look at all of the different social services that go into violence prevention, if there is a lack of violence, there is money on the table. We can take that equity, that value, and give it an actually a dollar amount year on year if there is not violence in that zip code. In addition, when there is no violence, property values rise. And that value add between what property values are today and what they could be with a lack of violence, that itself is a peace dividend. When we're trying to develop parts of the city, we utilize this through special taxing incentives. We can do that in our most violent communities by returning that equity back to the community, that the property values that are created don't just go into the city coffers, don't go to the county, but go back to the community. So if we capture the value, the next question is, how do we distribute it? Who is it that makes the decisions about where we put this extra cash? That extra money that came by, we don't need that many police, that the values have gone up. How do we capture it, and how do we distribute it? The communities who are at the heart of this effort, the grassroots activists, even the local politicians who need to be brought into a process. Because ultimately, you play the cards that you have, not the ones that you want. And the reality of our city and cities around the country and around the world is that local politicians do want to get involved. So co-opt them into this. Create the small local foundations needed, zip code by zip code, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, that the equity is returned to and distributed. So we've now got this money. We've now got a distribution. So again, what fills the space where violence once was? The community can do many different things. It can create night basketball courts. It can do beautification murals. It can build things like the Stony Arts Bank. It can return jobs, training. It can fill the space with grants to local schools. It can do what the community feels it needs to do. And most importantly, this money is the community's. This isn't coming from elsewhere. We're not moving money from A to B. We're not asking for gentrification to come in so that the people who benefit from the community's absence of violence are newcomers. But rather, the equity that has been created is redistributed back to the community today. And we create an incentive cycle where virtuous behavior, the ability to prevent violence, is rewarded with more equity, and that equity is reinvested in structures and programs, in things that make the community more inhabitable, more livable, more beautiful. And in itself creates a virtuous cycle of investment. But ultimately, it's not about the things. It's not about the basketball courts. It's not about the structures that we create. It's about the community itself. It's the people. It's the relational capital. Time and time again today, you've heard about resiliency, about building in individuals, about investing in yourselves. And our communities themselves need to be their own quarterbacks. It's the community that decides that it's going to invest in its young people. It's the people who sit every day on the block and says that this corner is the community's corner, not someone else's. That is the relational capital that enables us to move from a concept of an absence of violence to peace, to something that is investable in, to something that can actually develop and help communities continue to move forward, so that we're not holding back the violence, praying that the waters don't come above us and don't crush us and drown us. But rather, we build from within and we create a resiliency against violence as a community that is rewarded for the hard, difficult steps that are going on day in, day out, that in systemic underinvested communities, and communities dealing with the most difficult things imaginable, we've created a sustainability of funding. And funding doesn't sound sexy. When we look at the research, we think a lot about the jobs training programs. We think exactly about how the impact of our program will affect this person who's out of a system. But if we don't think about how the money gets back to the community, we don't create the sustainability loops that we need to ensure that once violence has gone, it does not return. And the urgency of this task could not be greater. Just last week, on Friday night, Chantal and Andrea were two activists with a group called Mothers Against Senseless Killings, MASK. And for the past 4 years, these two mothers, alongside mothers and fathers from across the Englewood community, had been staking out a corner of 75th and Stewart. This was a historically extremely violent corner. And for 4 years, led by Tamar Manasseh, these mothers and fathers had staked out this community and created a space. They had stopped violence on the block. Until Friday night last week, where at 10 p.m., these two mothers were working to the shops and were killed by a drive-by shooter. But what Mask had done in these 4 years was remarkable, because they didn't just stop the violence. They decided to say, look, our kids no longer have schools they can go to, because they have to cross gang lines to go to the new schools after their schools were closed down. So they took the empty lot, the lack of investment, and they dropped on it a shipping container. And they created their own school called the Block Academy. And then they said, look, our lads also need jobs. Our young men and women need opportunity, and we need new sources of revenue. So they opened a pizza parlor in order so that every 25 cents of every dollar spent there could go to empower and sustain the activities that were going on 75th and Stewart. These women died last week doing something to reclaim their spot, to build the infrastructure necessary. What we need to do is to scale it. Because what this community, this small organization, not with a very large budget, had done, is they had raised their ambitions to say, if no one else is coming, we're going to do it for us. And our obligation is to ensure that we lack nothing but ambition. Good people should not lack resources. We must endow those in our communities who are willing to do the hard work. And what I've seen in my work in international conflicts is that it's possible. The walls that you saw earlier were from Northern Ireland. And after years, generations, decades, centuries of conflict, you saw that small-scale community foundations that looked at the peace dividend, that inspired communities, ensured that the walls that came up started having gates in them, that some walls could be torn down, that communities who never saw eye to eye together could create equity housing between them. It's possible there, it's possible here. Because if we can create virtuous cycles of investment, if we can understand that it's about the programs and how we fund them, if we can ensure that the communities are rewarded for the difficult steps that they take, then we can endow those trying to make a difference day in, day out, and the only thing that will hold us back is our ambition rather than our resources. Thank you very much.